Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claudia Winkler. I'm the Associate Director for Programs and Outreach here at the Berkley Center. And on behalf of Sean Casey, our Director, and Michael Kessler, our Managing Director, and the entire center, I'd like to welcome you all today to this talk. Dr. Eric Patterson will be talking about his book, Just American Wars: Ethical Dilemmas in U.S. Military History. It came out in January of 2019, so it's hot off the presses. He's also got several copies with him. You'll see for sale for $25 if you're interested, and you can pay with cash or check. Dr. Patterson is professor and past dean of the School of Government at Regent University in Virginia Beach, and he's had a long relationship and fruitful relationship with the Berkley Center. He's currently a research fellow here. Previously, from 2008 to 2012, he was here as full-time associate director, and he's published a number of books on just war thinking, including Ending Wars Well and Ethics Beyond War's End. He's served for over 20 years in command positions in the Air National Guard. He served as White House Fellow and twice worked at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs. At the State Department, he specifically worked on post-conflict issues in and traveled to Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Congo, Angola, and elsewhere. And he's the author and editor of 14 books, as well as numerous journal and magazine articles. So join me in welcoming Dr. Patterson. We look forward to your talk. No problem. The screen has now gone black. Okay.
Well, everybody, welcome. And for the first about 17 minutes, I'll be right here. And then I'm going to move to the table to take your comments and questions and answers. And I'm thankful that there's so many students here. If you're a student at Georgetown or another university, would you raise your hand? So we're about half students today, and then I'm thrilled to have so many of the rest of you here with us. And what I'd like to do is, you see in front of you, I left you with a free handout. One side of it is the table of contents of the book, so it gives you a sense of what the chapters are about, and then the other side are the basic just war principles that guide the thinking of the book. Let me say this. The Just American Wars does not go through every U.S. war and take this list of just war principles and try to apply every principle to how we went to war, how we fought the war, and everything. Instead, what the book does is it looks at one or two discrete moral principles that you see on this list, and then it teases them out about what were the controversies or the dilemmas that military officers and presidents faced in each of those conflicts. And what we'll do in a few minutes is I'll give you a teaser of 2 or 3 of the chapters, and then we'll take some Q&A. Before we do that, let me just say it's a delight to be back here at Georgetown. I love the Berkley Center. I spent 4 great full-time years here. I see faces in the audience that have been friends or associates in the past, and I'm thankful for you coming today. So with that, what made me write this book in the first place? When I was leaving Georgetown in the fall of 2012, I had an invitation to speak at 2 conferences the following year on the question, was the American Revolution, was going to war, a just war? Was it moral for George Washington and the others to go to war? And I thought I thought everybody knew that the American War for Independence was a just war. I didn't know that there were people out there, revisionist historians, who don't feel that way. And so I was ambushed on a panel where everyone was against George Washington. They thought he was a terrorist, and that going to war in 1776, they felt that it was an unjust war to begin with. And if you're interested in the logic of that, we can handle it during the Q&A. But that was the genesis of this book, was asking these harder questions about the morality of the decisions that real men and women had to make in our political system at the time. Now, the just war tradition, as you see on the paper, it's a venerable tradition that goes back to the classical era, to Cicero and then Augustine, and through the Catholic Church and through the Protestant Reformation, and then was secularized into the law of armed conflict. And so it's the basis for our laws of war today. And it really historically has asked 2 questions. When is it moral to go to war, and you see a list there. And that list begins with the notion that legitimate political authorities have a responsibility at times to act on a just cause and with right intention. And what might a just cause be? Augustine said that a just cause would be things like righting a past wrong, punishing wrongdoers, or setting the stage for preventing further wrong. And intentions really matter in the just war tradition. Augustine said that the evil in war wasn't that people died. The evil in war would be people acting out of hatred, motivated by greed, motivated by lust, motivated by envy. But that there were positive intentions that could lead to war, such as wanting to act out of love to protect your neighbor. And so this type of moral reasoning is the just war tradition, and it's the frame for how I looked at these wars in American history. So let me give you a couple of examples from the book, and then we'll move to some comments and question and answer. And let me mention three of the chapters: the War of 1812, the Vietnam War, and World War I. Because during the writing of these books, all three of those wars had anniversaries. So first, the War of 1812. When I started writing this book, we were in the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, which lasted from 1812 to 1815. And there was a lot of commentary at the time that said that forgotten war, that war that we don't really remember, was unnecessary. So that made me wonder, why did we go to war in 1812? The last time I had heard about it was when I was in high school in my American history class. And if you remember back to high school, you remember the word impressment, that American sailors were impressed to work on British naval vessels. So going back in history, President Madison in 1812 argued that the British Empire was conducting economic warfare against the United States, and it had been for more than a decade, in two ways. The first one was that the British Empire was either putting embargoes or tariffs on U.S. trade to the cost of approximately $5 billion US. So it was stifling our economy. And second, that up to, historians today estimate that as many as 15,000 US sailors had been involuntarily taken off of American merchant vessels on the high seas and taken involuntarily where they had to work in the almost slavish conditions of British men of war. Remember, Britain had been at war with France from about 1793 all the way till 1815, with only a couple of hiatuses during the Napoleonic era. So the British Navy needed seamen, and they would involuntarily, they would conscript American sailors. Well, if you do the math, in today's numbers, imagine a U.S. president who is faced with over 700,000 U.S. sailors being taken off of cargo ships by the Chinese or the Russians and put on their warships today. That would be a reason to go to war, don't you think? That would be a casus belli. And that's what motivated President Madison to go to war in 1812 and ask Congress for a declaration of war for that war. And we won. Second case that's in the book is World War I. And that case is not about why we went to war, and it's not about how we fought the war. It's about how the Allies decided to impose a peace treaty exactly 100 years ago this spring on the Germans and their allies. And the book provides really three almost caricatures of the big three leaders who won at the end of the war. France's leader, Georges Clemenceau, Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and the US President, Woodrow Wilson. And let me walk you through the different motivations that drove their approaches to policy. Here's the question. At the end of a war, what is the just way to end a war? And I'm going to use the political positions of these three guys to sketch out three very different ways to bring a war to termination. So the French had lost close to 1 million men on the battlefields. The entire war was fought in France and Belgium. There was no battles on German soil. So 3.5 years of war, 2.4 million wounded or homeless or displaced, or those who died by disease. Close to 1 million French died on the battlefield. The French wanted revenge. And they didn't want just revenge for all the killing that had happened. A generation before, in the Franco-Prussian War, the German army had marched down the streets of Paris and forced a 5 billion gold mark indemnity on the French. So the French had lost a generation before. They'd had 3.5 years of terrible warfare on their soil between 1914 and the end of 1918, and they wanted revenge. And you know how World War ended with the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans had to accept guilt for the war. Sir, there's a seat right here, right in the front. The Germans had to accept war guilt. There was the attempt to impose war crimes tribunals, like happened at the end of World War II, on over 2,000 Germans. There was massive reparations demanded. The French lost all of their overseas territories, and they lost eastern parts of their country with troops by the treaty on the ground for 15 years in parts of Germany. So it was a draconian punishment, and the French wanted all that and more to make the Germans pay. And of course, the question is vengeance really the moral way as well as the pragmatic way to end a war? Or did the French position sow the seeds for future wars? Now, the Brits had a slightly different view. David Lloyd George was their prime minister, and he argued throughout 1918, very similarly to the French, that we need to pound the Germans, we need to ask them for indemnities or payoffs or reparations for all the costs to the British Empire during the war. But in his secret negotiating instructions to his team who negotiated the treaties that ended the First World War, he took a very different note, because David Lloyd George recognized that if you crush your adversary, sooner or later they're going to rise up. The strong German nation would rise up again and want revenge. Let me read to you just a little bit about what he wrote to his negotiators. When nations are exhausted by war, in which they've put forth all their strength and which leave them bleeding and broken, it is not difficult to patch up a peace that may last until the generation which experienced the horrors of that war has passed away. Pictures of heroism and triumph only tempt those who know nothing of suffering and the terrors of war. So it's comparatively easy to patch up a peace which will last for 30 years. What is difficult, however, is to draw up a peace which will not provoke a fresh struggle when those who have practical experience of what war means have passed away. History has proved that a peace which has been hailed by a victorious nation as a triumph, in the long run, has proved itself to be short-sighted and charged with danger to the victor. You may strip Germany of her colonies, reduce her armaments to a mere police force, and her navy to that of a fifth-rate power. All the same, if she feels that she's been unjustly treated in the peace of 1919, she will find means of extracting retribution from her conquerors. The deep impression made on the human heart by 4 years of unexampled slaughter will disappear with the hearts upon which it has been marked. The maintenance of peace will then depend upon there being no future causes of exasperation, constantly stirring up the spirit of patriotism, of justice, of fair play. Our terms may be severe, they may be stern and even ruthless, but at the same time, they can be so just that the country in which they are imposed will feel in its heart that it has no right to complain. But injustice, arrogance, displayed in the hour of triumph, will never be forgiven or forgotten. And for those of you who know, that draconian Peace of Versailles was something that did rankle in the hearts of the Germans. The negotiators in Paris at the peace conference in 1919 did not heed David Lloyd George, and they imposed a vengeance on the Germans, and it's as if he foreshadowed exactly what would happen. So one model is David Lloyd George, who argued for order and a limited justice. Another model is extreme vengeance. A third model, represented by Woodrow Wilson, is revolution. Now you recall that Woodrow Wilson at the end of the First World War gave a speech with his famous 14 points. Open treaties, open covenants, openly arrived at, transparency, freedom of the seas, the self-determination of all people groups. Now, to us today, that sounds like, oh, that's just what we talk about as Americans. We love democracy. But Woodrow Wilson was not talking in his day about a world in which we live. He was talking about overthrowing the status quo. He reveled in the end of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires. And by extension, he was suggesting that the French, the Italian, and the British empires, his allies, that their empires were morally bankrupt as well. He called for disarmament not just of his foes, but of his allies. And he had a messianic complex. When you read his diary and his letters and his speeches, he believed that he was uniquely appointed for that day and time by God to change world history. He was going to burn down the old regime and leap into a 21st century model. And people groups on the ground in Europe, they heard that. They heard this call for self-determination, and in some places perpetrated outright revolution. And so Wilson's model was not just democracy and elections. It was a model that said we sweep away the past and recognize that there'll be some pain, that some things will get burned down in a revolutionary process, but it's worth it in the long run. But you might say, yeah, I've never really heard that before, Dr. Patterson. That doesn't sound like the Woodrow Wilson. I thought he was a benign pro-democracy guy. But let me tell you, in his speech to Congress in January of 1918, when he lays out the 14 points for the first time, he praises the Russian Revolution. He says that the spirit of what's going on in the hearts of the Russian people at the time is a universal spirit of brotherhood that's going to change the face of the world forever. And he says that that struggle is our own struggle. So he has the view, a revolutionary view, a view of dramatic change. And the argument that I make in the book is whether you're Lenin or Mao or Robespierre or even Woodrow Wilson, that the just war tradition doesn't call for burning down the old system. Let me say a few words about Vietnam, and then we'll move to Q&A. By the way, for those of you, if you're looking for a seat, there's two right here, and there's one at the table right there, and you're welcome to slip in and take those seats and make yourself comfortable. Vietnam. This also happens to be, this academic year happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive, of some of the escalation in Vietnam, of the election that transitioned LBJ out and Nixon in. So it's very much a year where eyes are turned towards the Vietnam War. And this book asks the question, was it just for American presidents to go to war and to prolong the war in Vietnam? Well, how do you even get at that? This is a war where the U.S. was involved in one way or the other. Now, save me that seat, though. But there's one right here if you want it. The U.S. was involved over 4 presidencies for 2 decades in some way in French Indochina. So how do you get your hands on this question? And the answer that I give in the book is to look at presidential war aims. So presidents in speeches, in their national security directives and things, they will lay out the rationale for defense and for national security. And starting in the Eisenhower administration moving forward, we have a continuity of statements. And the book really focuses on JFK and then LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and then the Nixon administrations. And I find consistently, in fact, using the same language over and over, that these presidents elaborate 3 war aims. The first one is to contain communism. So you remember from your foreign policy classes, our goal was not to roll back communism during the Cold War, but it was to contain it, to apply pressure so it couldn't spread any further. And that was what the presidents all said in this case. And the second was to demonstrate the credibility of our resolve to help an ally. Starting with, especially with Eisenhower would make the argument, but JFK picks it up, that if the communists are pushing in one part of the world and we allow them to win, that's a shot heard around the world. A loss in Vietnam is felt in East Berlin. A loss in Vietnam is felt in Africa. And so we have to demonstrate not only to our allies that we will back them up against insurgencies, but we have to show our enemies that we're resolved. And we have to show that the countries that are on the fence, the non-aligned countries, that were resolved and will help them if they ask for it. And then the third criteria was to hold or extend democracy wherever it is. And South Vietnam, as a part of the the Paris Accords of 1954, was supposed to be ruled by elections. They had elections. They were imperfect, as many of you know. The question about unification was supposed to go to an election of all the people on the Vietnamese in North and South Vietnam. There was a variety of positions and reasons why that was not allowed to occur. And as you can imagine, over time, the North Vietnamese were not all that thrilled with the idea of letting their common people vote as the years went by. Particularly Lyndon Baines Johnson truly believed that Vietnam was a young, struggling democracy, and that by devoting ourselves to development and to infrastructure, that it could become a thriving democracy over time. Let me give you an example. Johnson believed that the Mekong Delta, which is this huge irrigated delta, like the Nile River Delta or the Mississippi Delta, he believed that that set of waterways had enough industrial power to become the next Tennessee Valley Authority. So for those of you who are a little bit older and you think about the Depression that LBJ grew up in, and the Tennessee Valley Authority provided electricity to millions of people across the rural South, he had that type of vision for Vietnam. So those are the three war aims: contain the communists, hold or extend democracy, demonstrate resolve. And I believe that they actually meet basic just war criteria. But I think that there's two other war aims that are unstated in all of this. The first one is ego. We know from the diaries of the people around JFK, from the interviews of LBJ himself and others, and of course from those around Nixon, that all three of these presidents were very worried about their own reputations for toughness. For instance, JFK told his inner circle, I'm going to go into this meeting with Khrushchev and I'm going to show him, the president of the Soviet Union, I'm going to show him who the toughest SOB in the room is. LBJ was consistently concerned about demonstrating that he was tough, because he felt like if he wasn't tough in Vietnam, he'd get edged out of the presidency by Bobby Kennedy, and that he had to show how tough he was so that the Great Society projects at home would move forward. And of course, Nixon told the senior members of the administration to let the North Vietnamese know that he was actually a little bit crazy. He might push the button. So they needed to come to the negotiating table because Nixon was so tough and that he might be irresponsible. So that is not a reason, that's not a just war reason, whether you're Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte or a US president. That's not a good reason, your personal reputation for toughness, to prolong a war. Last one, the issue of national honor. When you read the speeches of JFK, and then especially Johnson and Nixon, they talk a lot about peace with honor. In one speech, Nixon says it 7 times as he talks about going into the peace talks with the government of North Vietnam. Peace with honor. And what they mean, usually, is that we've spent so much money in fighting this war, and we've lost so many lives, that it would desecrate the sacred blood that was spilled in the past if we don't continue the war to win. Now, I have to tell you that after more than 20 years as an Air Force Reserve officer, there's a part of that logic that touches my heart, that I'm sympathetic to a view that we need to honor the sacrifice of those who've gone before us. But think through the logic of that type of honor, that we're going to prolong war so that people who died in the past didn't die in vain. It's actually not a very good logic, is it? It isn't a logic that meets, in my opinion, the just war criteria, because there's other ways to demonstrate honor. You can take care of the wounded. You can take care of widows and orphans. You can make sure that you appropriately memorialize those who did die in battle. So I'm not saying that we dishonor those who served, And I don't say that there isn't an honor component there. What I am saying is that when it comes to just war criteria that justify continuing a war, trying to vindicate the sacred blood that was spilled in the past by prolonging the war in the now does not meet that criteria, although there may be other things. So those are the types of cases that this book seeks to elucidate. It's designed to be fun to read for historians and armchair historians. It's designed to also raise critical questions for those who are in public service today. And with that, we're going to transition to a time of Q&A. I'm going to move to the table just for the ease of being able to make eye contact and things. And if you have a question or comment, I'll raise your hand, I'll call on you. And I will privilege students or people who look like students first, just because sometimes they get edged out. So if you kind of look like a student to me, I may call on you first, and then I'll extend it, of course, to our more mature audience members as well. So thank you. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask?
I'm a junior at Washington Adventist University. Oh, okay. And I've got a question on regarding morality in war. So, when a state wages war into another state for whatever reason that is, this state has a duty, an intrinsic duty to its citizens to keep them safe from harm. So, I want to know your opinion if you think that the shackles of morality would hold the state back in fulfilling those duties to its citizens.
Thanks. I don't know that I've ever heard someone call it the shackles of morality before, and that's a book title right there. That's waiting to be written by someone. I do think that self-defense, say December 8th, 1941, after the U.S. was attacked by Japan, is the fundamental principle for the state protecting its people. You know, the both in the just war tradition, which begins with this principle of legitimate authority, and the way that that has become a part of international relations through the principle of sovereignty, the basic social contract is that the government is to protect its people. So I don't see it as a shackling thing. I think it's the North Star for government policies to provide for self-defense. And the argument that I make in the book about the American Revolution is that war actually started when the British started shooting colonists in April of 1775 at Lexington and Concord. And that date's important. It was April of 1775. We didn't write the Declaration of Independence until July of 1776. There was 14 months of armed conflict during which the colonists were arguing, we don't want independence, but we'll defend ourselves. 14 months of that until the Declaration of Independence. So that's a self-defense argument. Thanks.
So I heard you mention. Oh, my name is Andy Madrano. I'm a sophomore at Washington Adventist University, and I heard you mentioned justice and vengeance for a reason to start war. One of the reasons you mentioned, and I wanted to ask your opinion if it's a just reason for war. I would say it's a little bit even emotional, and it's not as drastic to put people's lives at stake and to how would I say this? Go to that extreme.
I'm going to have you send it down to that gentleman there while I answer your question, okay? So if I understand your question you're asking about when a country goes to war, if there's some vengeance mixed in there, does it make the whole war unjust? And I think that the answer is no. But what you're pointing out is that every conflict has a lot of human emotions in it. So throughout particularly the classical Christian just war tradition, there has historically been an emphasis on the types of things that would help people act on behalf of love, act to punish wrongdoers out of a sense of righteous indignation, but not let that become sinful, bitter hatred. And of course, here at Georgetown in the Catholic tradition, we make those distinctions. During the Middle Ages as well, there was a set of things that the church did to try to help soldiers not fall into that hatred and bitterness. It's beyond this book, but for instance, pre-war absolution of soldiers and then post-war absolution of soldiers through masses and things to try to get the heart right. I would say that on December 8th, 1941, there were a lot of Americans who were very, very angry and wanted vindication or vengeance against the Empire of Japan. Over time, what you want to do is, as the Bible says, be angry and sin not. In other words, act out of righteous indignation and for the vindication of rights, but not act in a hateful way that calls for the extermination of one's enemies in a Hitlerian sense.
Stanley Kober, I'm a Georgetown alum. You have been defining just war in terms of substantive criteria, but the American Constitution defines it in terms of process. It's less about the substance, because if one person has the power, as Abraham Lincoln wrote to his law partner, William Herndon, the president can say anything. If today the president should choose to say he thinks it necessary to invade Canada, how could you stop him? You may say to him, I see no probability of the British invading us, but he will say to you, be silent. I see it if you don't. So Madison and the other founders substituted procedural criteria, and I would say two in particular. One, that a declaration of war is undertaken by Congress, not by the president. Any act of war, the Supreme Court endorsed this, any offensive act. And second, the reasons have to be publicly given. The bulk of the Declaration of Independence is a list of particulars against the British. I would say this goes back to the model set by Rome with the officials. They would throw, you know what I'm talking about. If our cause is just, then we should be granted victory. It's an appeal to the gods. And this was an appeal to international public opinion. If you have a public declaration of the causes and it is deliberated in a legislature, you cannot have a surprise attack. You've given notice. People have time to prepare. Surprise attack is a major cause, a major way that wars of aggression originate. So this is a way of addressing wars of aggression. So I would like you to address this. You were focusing on the substantive criteria, but it seems to me what the United States tried to do at its founding was substitute procedural criteria.
Yeah. So, and Stanley, would you pass it to this young lady here in the green? You raised a lot of issues, and so I'm going to kind of shotgun back three things. The first one is that you're right, that the colonists made an appeal that was similar to the Romans in the sense of an appeal to heaven, to divine providence. And they did that in not that the Declaration of Independence was the 12th, depending on how you count them, of a series of declarations and rights and grievances. The book talks about the Declaration of Rights and Grievances of the United Colonies from July 2nd, 1775, which also lays out all of these grievances. Things like the British quartering troops in their homes, the British taking property and only giving a small amount of money in favor of it, the concern about religious freedom, the fact that the courts were being shut down in Massachusetts and that citizens would be tried in admiralty courts under admiralty law or taken to Canada instead of trial by jury, on and on and on. So you're exactly right that there's these public lists of grievances at the time of the American Revolution, and the by the way, for those of you who wonder, kind of the legitimate authority aspect is that that both secularists and clergy during the Revolution made the argument that the Continental Congress was a legitimate authority protecting the colonials against rapacious London. I agree with you that transparency is very, very important, although I don't think that it always works, such as the way that we had to write the second Constitution after the Articles of Confederation. But transparency, the press, freedom of speech, the right to assemble, our First Amendment liberties, they actually all are breaks, as is checks and balances between the executive and the legislature. They're all breaks on going to war. I will say one other note. The introductory chapter talks about what becomes the Uniform Code of Military Justice that governs the U.S. troops today. That began with an immigrant to the United States by the name of Francis Lieber, who taught at Columbia College, and he wrote to the commander-in-chief of the Union armies, General Halleck, and he suggested to them that we needed a new military code, that what we had was a very, very thin instructions for how soldiers should behave that went back to the War of 1812, and that we needed a fully embodied law of armed conflict for how our troops behave. That code became General Order Number 100 from Abraham Lincoln. It became what is today the Code of Military Justice, and it was so important in its day, it within 5 years was adopted by Britain, France, Prussia, and other countries. And so a lot of people don't realize this, but these just war principles, when they became embodied in how troops fight, and the things like the Geneva and the Hague Conventions, they all came from a guy during the U.S. Civil War who took these principles that you read about and put them into a military code on the Union Army, starting in 1863. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Alicia, and I work at a think tank on nuclear weapons policy. So I think a lot about just war criteria, particularly relating to jus in bello as it relates to nuclear weapons use. And one thing that I've found is that it seems that people can sometimes make arguments using just war criteria kind of for different scenarios, and that the criteria can be somewhat subjective, and in terms of what constitutes proportionality, what constitutes what's discriminate. And so I was just wondering if, while you were using these principles to evaluate various wars, you were able to develop a type of methodology or a way of making the criteria seem less subjective, to be able to bring them together to make an evaluation.
Wow. So you asked at least two humongous questions. And if you don't mind, I'm going to say why they're big, since we have a lot of undergraduates in the room. Not to be patronizing, but just to unpack two big things that she brought up. So one is a set of questions about, if you can drop a bunch of nuclear bombs and wipe out the entire human race, isn't that just unjust by definition? Or are there nuanced ways to think about all the issues that have to do with weapons of mass destruction? So she lit a fire right there. And then the second one, on the moral reasoning part, is, isn't it the case that these are subjective criteria, and whoever happens to be in the hot seat at the time just gets to decide whichever ones really, really matter? And so I'm going to handle the second one, and then I'll handle the first. And I won't answer them all, but you'll be happy to know that there's a chapter on dropping the atomic bomb and Christian nuclear reasoning versus secular in the 1960s with Paul Ramsey and the Catholic bishops and the whole thing. So this second question about the subjective nature of the just war criteria. I think that here's the answer to that, and that is that the fact that there are these criteria, the fact that they've developed over 2,000 years, the fact that even people who are nefarious go back to these criteria to try to justify things, is one of those moments where it's clear that actually there is a basic sense of morality, and everybody knows it. And even nefarious individuals try to justify themselves using this. So that says something about their own cunning or guile. It doesn't take away from the credibility of this. The just war tradition it's a framework. It's not a perfect guide for policy. What we want is moral statesmen and moral stateswomen and their advisors to be judicious and pragmatic in applying these moral criteria in a foggy world in which we live. I will say that what's critical on that is that we really do need to start with the principles of authority, just cause, and right intention first, and then move through those other prudential criteria rather than putting them out of order. Because if what you start with is say, oh, just like any Tom, Dick, or Harry who can write an op-ed gets to decide when we're at last resort, and then we'll work our way back to just cause or right intention, the whole thing falls apart. There is a place for expertise in morality. Now, on to, and how about we send the microphone down to the father? Thanks for the next comment or question. Let me say something about kind of the morality of nuclear weapons and just some of the questions that are there. The chapter in this book looks at Truman's decision to use nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb, in 1945. And there's a lot that could be said about that, but I would say a couple things. You mentioned that typically when we think about nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, we think in terms of use and bellow. So we think that they're so destructive, how do you make them discriminating? And second, how do you make it to what is it a proportionate response? And an argument I make in the book is that we have to start by thinking about nuclear weapons as under legitimate authority first and foremost. So it's very, very important, and you think about a place like Pakistan or something, it's very, very important first and foremost that when we start talking in the 2000s about nuclear weapons, that they really are securely under the control of legitimate governing authorities. We kind of take that for granted, but that's important because that's who you want making the decisions, and it should serve as a guide for policy about nuclear nonproliferation and things. And then these questions about just cause and right intention. In Truman's case, in August of 1945, the battle estimates that he had were that there'd be 1 million US casualties if we had to invade the Japanese homeland in the traditional fashion. And so he later said, I didn't lose a night's sleep over dropping that bomb. And remember, the US was not this huge war machine on December 7th, 1941. When the Japanese attacked, the US Army had 300,000 men in it. It was a tiny army. We weren't aggressors. It was a sneak attack in the middle of the night. The men who became the 5 million man army of 1945, in 1941, they were shopkeepers and insurance agents and farmers. Truman's primary responsibility, I argue, as the legitimate authority acting on just cause, was first and foremost to protect US citizens, and then second, to draw the war to a close as fast as he could. And he was doing that by using the atomic weapon. Second, and kind of related to that idea, is simply that Winston Churchill estimated that not only would the US lose 1 million troops, but that the British Empire would lose 250,000 of their own as casualties if there had to be an invasion of Japan to liberate Singapore and other places. So that's what the book does, is the book looks at that. The book also looks at, and I won't talk about it right now, I don't want to ramble, but the book talks about the idea of deterrence. And deterrence is in a sense, a promise that if you attack me, I'm going to blow your socks off. If you attack, we're going to drop nukes on you. And the book looks at the debate between the theologian Paul Ramsey and the Catholic bishops about whether or not Christians, people in the Christian tradition, can actually do deterrence. Because deterrence is either deception or it's a promise to wipe out your opponent. And the book does talk about that at length. Thanks.
I was born on April 19th, 1940, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that is Patriots Day.
Yep.
Now it's the closest Monday to April 19th. But since that was Patriots Day and a local holiday, I didn't have to go to school on my birthday. Was that just? Because that, April 19th, as you pointed out, there wasn't exactly too much, authority or certainly there was some intention, but there would be the likelihood of success and things like that would come up. Would you consider it just?
That you didn't have to go to school?
Well, and the fact that this is considered to be the start of the American Revolution.
Yeah. What I would say is when it comes to whether or not you had to go to school, although it wasn't a war, your parents were the legitimate authority. And so they get to decide.
Oh, no. It was a local holiday.
Oh, is that
parade? No.
Right. Okay. Well, then again, the state had made that decision, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I'm not sure that it's a war, but it certainly was just. And it does, those types of things do fit into the notion about how important it is, in the view that I adumbrate in this book, how important it is to learn lessons from war, and one of the way you learn lessons from war should be that there's civic memorial events, such as parades, wreaths at the tomb of the unknown soul. All of that infrastructure I actually think is pretty important. And I don't think that since 9/11 we've done it all that well for our current troops. So thanks for asking. It is a pretty interesting question. Sir, do you mind passing your microphone to the lady in the orange? And while that's happening, would you go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll do over here, and then we'll come to you. Go ahead. Just say it loudly.
Okay, I'm Samira Daniels. I've been here before, but here's the thing. To sort of update your the just war, and this is what I found when I came here, and that is that at the time, since the Clinton administration, the emphasis was, or a debate was occurring in the military about the transformation of the military and updating it. And in light of that, certain things certain issues emerged that in order to transition and to transform, that we had to do certain things. I mean, prepare the military, and part of that was engaging as a trial in these wars. Also, that is, they became venues for the transformation that Donald Rumsfeld and others, and even in the Democrat and liberal in the Clinton administration, to transform the army. And in light of that, if that is what was going on, how would you see the just war tradition? Because even Andrew Bacevich lists that there were 5 or 6 large goals and objectives that from one administration to another there was consensus. So you would have to alter those objectives somehow, or carve out a just war theory that is also updated. And I saw that the just war theory, as they were implementing or stating the principles, was so related more to the wars that you were talking about, specifically world wars. So do you understand my question? I mean, how do you update the just war theory? I mean, because it's already being done through the national security law community.
So I'm gonna try to not ramble, but give 2 answers. And so a short one on transformation, and that's a term of art in the U.S. military that we associate with particularly the era of Donald Rumsfeld and Secretary Gates, who pretty much kept all of his programs going. And then second, this bigger question about areas of transformation or the extension of just war thinking into the 21st century. So on the first one, transformation of the military in the first Bush in the George W. Bush administration had nothing to do with terrorism or anything like that. What it had to do with was modernizing the way that we do business at the Pentagon. So trying to modernize, get rid of technology that had been built in the early 1980s and business practices that were outdated, and try to technologically, and especially in terms of business practices, transform that way that we do business. Get away from a Cold War model of massive armies to a lean, technologically sophisticated expeditionary force that could go out quickly, use technology, and get back. But such a big part of transformation was things like Lean Six Sigma and business practices. It wasn't changes necessarily to the profession of arms in a lot of ways. It was primarily about trying to make the Pentagon run much more smartly, so it wasn't just a command and control hierarchical environment. And remember, Rumsfeld had decades in the business sector, and so he was trying to bring those lessons into the Pentagon. And he and his 2 successors, they actually did a lot of those types of things. At the same time, what he wasn't expecting was 9/11 and then the war in Iraq. Remember, Rumsfeld was the one guy who kept saying, he famously said about the war in Iraq, I don't know if we'll be there for 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months. We will not be there for 5 years. Rumsfeld's view all along was, these are distractions, so I'm going to try to keep transformation still going nonetheless. No nation building, et cetera. People don't really realize that today. It's well documented. Rumsfeld was on a different page on a lot of these things. But what he said was, I'm going to try to drive transformation through this time of all of this other change. And in some areas he was successful, in others not. And I do think that that's separate. So let me just say some of the what I'd call the frontiers of just war thinking today. And there's a lot of great thinking about this. 2 years ago, the preeminent just war historian who've had speak here before, James Turner Johnson, and I published an edited volume of 35 chapters called the Ashgate Handbook, the Ashgate Research Companion on Military Ethics. It's the kind of book that's very expensive that the library buys and you check out. And it's 35 chapters by experts, and many of the chapters are on the frontiers of just war thinking today. Let me mention a couple. One is authority. So in an increasingly supranational world, in other words, where at least until very recently it seemed like the UN was receiving more and more authority, how do you make a decision about who's really responsible in a chaotic, insecure world? UN blue helmets, peacekeepers, or the state that's invaded by someone else? What if you're invaded, but the UN Security Council won't vote to send in the peacekeepers or something? So in a way different from the previous 2 centuries, the devolution of power from national capitals has a real consequence. A second one is instantaneous and autonomous forms of technology like artificial intelligence or drones. And of course, at one level, those things are guided by humans. But as we increasingly go down towards logarithmic decision making, so if we're being attacked 1 million times a day by the Chinese government trying to get into our infrastructure, our banks, our military, we don't have time to sit around and pontificate. We need defense and offensive logarithmic, in other words, computers immediately responding. But what are the ethics? I mean, how far do you go? When do you respond? Do you just do it at our water's edge, or do you hit them back? So there's a whole set of questions there. And I'm happy to say there's lots of people thinking about those types of things. And then a third one, for the past 15 years, is this jus post bellum that you see on your sheet. That wasn't really a part of the just war tradition throughout history, but the West has decided to emphasize reconstruction and stabilization at the end of warfare. And so that has become, and how you do that, I have a model and a couple of books about it, where you go from order to justice to conciliation. But that's a moral frontier right there. So thanks for asking, ma'am. And then we're going to go over here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Marie Janis with Pax Christi International, which is a international Catholic peace movement. I have 2 questions about 2 just war criteria: proportionality and last resort. In terms of proportionality, it does seem that in recent decades that the world has become more attuned to the consequences of a war fought, consequences that are psychological and environmental and so on, that might not have been considered before. And I would assume that in the consideration of proportionality, that the spectrum of consequences would have to be considered in advance to the best of the ability. But my real question is about last resort. In a world where tremendous resources are now spent preparing for war around the world and certainly in our own country, does, in the long run, and I'm not so much talking about how we evaluate past wars, but as we move into the future, is there a consequent obligation even from the just war tradition itself for proportional investment in nonviolent approaches to dealing with crisis situations? So, for example, should we be investing as much in diplomacy as we are in military preparedness? Should we be investing, and et cetera? And is there an obligation from your perspective, in our doing so, not just as a country, but globally, in order to the best of our ability, really ensure that a move to war is the last resort?
So on your first point, I'm not sure that there was a question there, but I will just simply say that proportionality is both a prudential criteria for going to war. In other words, is the grievance such that the use of armed force is appropriate? And second is in the jus in bello criteria, the notion of on this battlefield at this moment in time is the choice out of this menu of options, which is the one that's reasonably proportionate to what's going on. I will say that so those are the distinctions that and they both matter. They both matter. On your second question, I'm not sure that the just war tradition necessarily has a statement that you'd like for me to affirm. But I would say this, is that unfortunately what often happens is we take the law of armed conflict, the way that these things have been put into formal conventions like the Genocide Convention, the Convention Against Torture, the 1949 Geneva Convention, so the law, and we often act like it's this little special thing instead of recognizing that it's actually a part of the full spectrum of statesmanship. So both revolutionaries like Mao, who says that some of politics at least come out of the mouth of a gun, to Clausewitz, who says that war is politics by other means, they recognize that on a spectrum that includes armed humanitarian intervention, economic sanctions, defense, as well as military preparedness, that all of that is connected should be to a larger political project. And the goal of the just war tradition throughout its entirety has been the pursuit of peace. And that does make it different than a holy war, which gets peace by purifying the land, by wiping out the enemy. And it is different from what at least I would consider an idealistic commitment to nonviolence that may or may not be able to restrain the bad guys. An important just last point on this is that, two last points. So one is that there's a difference between force and violence. Just war people believe that force is lawful, it's restrained, it's targeted, it's directed towards a real problem. By violence, what we mean is unrestrained, hateful, maybe used by an illegitimate authority. And so just war thinkers say, we can tell the difference between the loving parent who spanks and physical abuse. And we can tell the difference between just police action and police brutality. And similarly, when it comes to international affairs, we can tell the difference between vengeful attacks that are designed to wipe out an enemy and restrained, lawful use of force. So, and maybe we'll just take one more question. I'll just leave it at that distinction, which is important for us. But let me just say one last thing, because it's part of our work at the Berkley Center. Is I personally believe that there's an entire spectrum for people of faith, like Pax Christi. There's an entire spectrum where what we want is we want people who are motivated on the front end towards the goal of peace and they want to stop war. And on the back end, it's often religious peacemakers and humanitarians that are the last people on the ground helping. But in the middle, we also want moral and religious arguments for restraining war when it's justified, and that it's not either or. My own view is we want people whose vocations span that. Sir. And then, I'm sorry, I told this young lady. Go ahead.
Okay, if you don't mind. Hi, I'm Alina. I'm a Georgetown master's student in the School of Foreign Service. I apologize, I came in a little late, so I'm unsure if maybe I've already talked about this, but I wanted to sort of, wait, okay, that's gross. Okay. I wanted to sort of mention and sort of talk with you about how, which my question is going to be, how the U.S. foreign policy community reconciles with our past when we use just war rhetoric to justify acts of massacre or rationalize certain policy decisions. And my frame of reference is the U.S. actions in Latin America throughout the 70s and 80s, supporting dictatorships, but specifically December 1981 in El Mozote, El Salvador, the U.S.-backed Salvadoran Army Battalion went into the village of El Mozote and massacred all 1,000 individuals. And the Reagan administration at the time in 1981 understood that that's what happened, but we utilized this just war rhetoric to ensure congressional funding to support that type of war and continue the massacres that we knew about. So I'm curious, again, how in today's world, as a foreign policy community, do we reconcile with that kind of past where clearly just war rhetoric is being used for the political aims, and how do we sort of how are we able to be perceived as a legitimate actor and a just actor in countries across Latin America when we've had that kind of complicated past?
Yes. So I'll say something about the Reagan administration, and then I'll also say something about the morality of this action. So it is worth noting that U.S. troops didn't engage in this. That we're not talking about U.S. troops. What we're talking about is a U.S. ally in the context of the Cold War fighting communists, and atrocities did happen. That's a matter of the historical record. So I don't disagree with you that the U.S. hasn't always made the best choices. This book is not an apology for everything that I mean a defense of everything that the U.S. has done. I would say that we broke many, many, many treaties with American Indians, for instance, and that's a shameful part of our past. So the book doesn't say that everything that the U.S. has ever done is correct. The way that you know, though, that it was wrong is by applying the just war criteria. That's the way we know that things were broken, is because that's the moral model for thinking about statecraft. I will note that the Reagan administration did make a distinction between authoritarians and totalitarians during the Cold War. And authoritarians were ones where there were some levels of freedom in their societies, and totalitarians were ones where there was zero freedom in the society. And so the Reagan administration was willing to work with, on a case-by-case basis, regimes, even if they did some things that we didn't like or that were morally repugnant. We were willing on a case-by-case basis to try to work with regimes, because what was simultaneously going on in that case, not that massacre, but in that case, was the killing of innocents in Nicaragua, the Sandinista Revolution, in El Salvador, there was an uprising by communist revolutionaries. There was one in Honduras as well as other places in Latin America. So the argument that was being made was, well, we can work with some of these authoritarian regimes, by the way, many of which were elected authoritarians, to stop this greater disorder by a threat that's a global threat. It doesn't make individual acts, though, right. And the way that we know, the bottom line is that we judge those acts actually, and you're judging them, it sounds like, appropriately by the just war criteria. So thanks for asking that. You've done me a great honor by coming today and asking these tough questions and participating, and I wish you the best. And finally, my thanks to Claudia and to Sean Casey and to Michael Kessler and the Berkley Center for supporting this. Thank you.